Coming up on the CHASIcast.
What is constructed in policy can never be perfectly mirrored in individuals' lives.
Dr. Amber Gazso, professor of sociology at UFV's School of Culture, Media and Society, talks about the challenge of balancing government assistance with substance use and how lessons from research in Ontario could change the equation elsewhere.
Might we shift the discourse about addiction, and how might that prompt us to think differently and do things differently?
The complexities of addiction and aid in this episode of the CHASIcast. From UFV's Community Health and Social Innovation Hub, this is the CHASIcast, a program dedicated to bringing experts and insights to the issues that shape our lives, because words have to matter. Now, here's your host, Dr. Martha Dow.
So I'm very excited on today's CHASIcast to have Dr. Amber Gazso, who is a colleague and a friend, and so been really excited about the possibility of having you on.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and excited to see what we come up with in this conversation.
Yeah, great. And also, congratulations, you have a new book. So we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that. And you're also a faculty associate here at CHASI. So thanks for all of your support.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of such an exciting opportunity here at UFV and to grow and work with everyone in CHASI.
Great.
And to settle into UFV even better through such a strong community organization.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we're enjoying having you here. Could we start just talking a little bit about your work and, sort of you're relatively new to UFV at this point, but tell us a little bit about the journey, if you could.
Yeah, thank you. So generally, I think I'll talk a bit about just my research areas, if that's helpful, and kind of how I think of myself as a researcher. So I tended, when prompted, to find myself as a feminist sociologist. Most of my work kind of moves through different research areas. In general, these are gender and family relations, citizenship, social policies in the welfare state, poverty and social inequality, and then research methods. And then in those broad kind of areas, I would say since actually my completing my PhD at the University of Alberta, I just became really, really interested in trying to understand individuals' relationships with social policies. And for the most part, I became really intrigued with trying to understand what it would be like to live a life, especially experiencing low income. And then in a way, though, where you are tied to and shaped by your relationships with specific income support policies like welfare or social assistance as we know it in Canada. So a lot of my work has somehow in some way over several years kept kind of moving back and forth, but always walking back to trying to understand, especially low-income individuals' experiences of raising kids or navigating different parts of their everyday life. And then yet in a way, again, where they are constrained or in some way regulated by their very relationships with the policy that offers them, say, income support.
It's so interesting, and yet it feels so big and yet not, because it's so interconnected, like so many systems.
Yes, exactly. So I find when I said like I'm always walking back to kind of focusing on especially low-income individuals' relationships with welfare, I think it's because a lot of what I've done over the years has, thought about aging in families or people as they're moving into midlife and how they have different relationships with other policies, whether it's healthcare policy or whether it's families navigating the relationships with childcare policy and child benefits, et cetera. And so, yes, in much of my research, somehow these policy systems are all interconnected and they come to bear on much of what I do. And then just though I just remember reading a particular paper in my PhD program and just being fascinated with the ways in which when you're experiencing low income, welfare and social assistance, we tend to call them welfare in the US and in Canada, but really we mean those provincial social assistance programs. I've just been struck by how in some way they're like a program of last resort. So when people are able to access them, when they are unemployed or when they are struggling, they're not actually receiving incomes of any significance to their lives. In fact, they're receiving below poverty level incomes. And so I just kept always coming back to that starting point. And then from there, often in different things that I do, those other policy systems come up. They kind of accidentally come up. And they're kind of there. They're always around the surface. And in fact, that's kind of a project I'm doing right now, is trying to really wrestle with like, well, then how do you manage relationships with more than one policy in your life? And that's kind of where I'm at right now in my current research project. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to do research that is so connected to policy? Because I think, that's not what lots of academics do.
No.
Can you talk about that bridge?
Yeah. I think what it is I would say you hold some of the key to it all, Martha. So for people listening, Martha was one of my professors when I was a student at UFV, and it was a course on policy and public and policy evaluation. And I think what happened is somewhere along the way, I became really intrigued with how, with our different governments and the creation of different policies to support people when they are in need, you have embedded in policy specific ideas and constructions of target populations. And you have embedded in policy specific ideologies about gender or family. And I think the best way to word it is I became really intrigued with how you can read policy for what is implied. So it might not be specifically stated, but you can get a pretty good sense in reading even the Ontario Works Act, for example, a pretty good sense of how families are defined, how they are constructed. And then I've always been fascinated with, well, if that's what it looks like on paper, then how does that play out in people's individual lives? Because of course, what is constructed in policy can never be perfectly mirrored in individuals' lives. So gosh, I think I've talked around in whereabouts, but I think I kind of got to. So I would say I'll circle back. Yes, doing academic research on policy for me has always been more of what I tend to, I have learned to frame it as more critical social policy analysis. So I would never say that I evaluate policy or design programs or then complete an evaluation of the success of a program, et cetera. I would say I'm much more interested in the conceptualizations and ideologies that are constituted within a policy, and then how that is perceived and felt by people who experience them. Mm-hmm. There we go.
Yeah, it's just fascinating and so critical to how we understand the social problems that we're all facing, and yet I think so often almost taken for granted.
Totally. So I think that's where I spend a lot of time reading policy, and that sounds like, oh, that's not very fun. No, but it's fascinating because, what we understand to be our social problems of interest, whether it's for policymakers, governments, or even just as academics, a very definition of them is always embedded in the policy in question. So again, whether it's Ontario Works Act, whether it's child benefits policy for all of Canada, et cetera, within those very structures, you always have a particular, well, I'll be a sociologist, a particular social construction of particular groups of people. And I think when we understand that then we have a more robust way of understanding then social inequalities that materialize and why we can't seem to fix the social problem, right? Because if we have these problematic constructions in place, then how can you ever bring about change? Because you just might keep reproducing the policy that creates the very contradictions in people's lives. There we go.
Yeah, that disconnect between how we construct a problem and what policy it.
Yeah. And then that makes me... reminds me of, in a lot of my work, I always tend to in some way use that exact language. I'm always talking in some way about the policy disconnect, or else like the mixed messages, or else often I use the language again of constraints, but I'm trying to get at like those paradoxes of like kind of like this is going on in real life, but this is how it's constructed to be in policy, and the two don't always meet. And so I don't know, I just kind of got stuck in that general area. And so I do other research too. That's more, I suppose you'd say, not exactly policy focused, but somehow in some way, I keep coming back.
Can you talk, mostly because I'm so interested, where are we at in the discourse around earning social assistance, right? So, I mean, obviously, policy doesn't deal with it explicitly in the way that historically it had in some ways. Where do you think we are in that public discourse?
In like earning, do you mean like...
that we have to, that our expectation is that people should earn their social assistance.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Sorry.
So no. I definitely, I was like, just clarifying. I was like, I hope I'm on the right track. Yes. I think it's a great question you're asking. The current research I'm doing is focusing on, I'll come at it like a little bit like sideways. The current project I'm doing is I'm working with various cities in Ontario and working with how they are administrating Ontario Works policy for low-income folks who are unemployed and in need of income support that is temporary. And Ontario, pardon me for speaking about Ontario. It's just that's where my last big chunk of research is from. So it will take me a bit longer to get up to speed on BC again. But in Ontario, like since the 90s, the entire rhetoric with the Mike Harris government, et cetera, was all about welfare as a last resort and how in order to receive any form of income support a month, one had to be engaged in employment activity. And these are like employment activity programming. So your conditions of eligibility to receive income support involved you conducting job searches, participating in education, et cetera. So there was always this sort of this conditionality has that kind of like earning emphasis that you're talking about. And then in my work, I would often write about that as sort of this orientation toward people having assumed to have a very like market-based relationship with income support. So meaning that they had to in some way demonstrate their employability in order to be perceived as deserving then of income support. Anyway, fast forward, and the ways that Ontario Works policy would make sure that happened is if people didn't meet the requirements, say, of their employability expectations, those set with caseworkers, they would then be sanctioned. So their benefits withheld for a month. So that idea of earning or the idea of you must do something in order to receive this has definitely been like a hallmark of, post 1990s Ontario Works, but it also it goes way back. Like it's got a much longer trajectory, which I won't go into, but that idea of that there's always this conditionality in that as a citizen, you are responsible to some way demonstrate your earning. And if you do so, then you are seen as deserving of support. That's always been in place with social assistance. However, so back to the current project that I'm doing with these three cities. What's interesting is in Ontario, at least, there is some change and movement towards looking at alternative ways, if you will, of granting income support each month. So there's actually been, there's a few pilot programs going on. They are through the province of Ontario, and it's trying to move away from that kind of employability imperative and trying to meet people in a situation where there's awareness that actually they're dealing with multiple challenges in their life. Unemployment might be just one of them. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I am curious what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years as Ontario especially starts to kind of experiment with transitioning away a little bit from this, like you need to show your employability in order to receive income support. So that work first orientation of Ontario Works that was really solidified in the 90s. I'm curious where that might go from 2023 onward, as the cities are gently trying out new models of ensuring that at the end of the day, ensuring people are receiving some semblance of income, but also maybe administering it through a different discourse, one not so much tied to you must earn, but one tied to like, what do you almost like a shift to like, what else might you need? And then how can we link your eligibility to that. So I think what, in answer to your question, I'm curious if the discourse will start to shift a bit, is the best way to word it. And then I'll be fascinated how, if on the page, there's this interest in the current buzzwords are life stabilization and a holistic model of Ontario Works delivery. So that's on paper, the current discourse that's emerging. And I'll be curious, because of the way I like to do these things, is will we see disconnects as we move along? Or will we see tensions between kind of these older neoliberal ideas of work first and these apparently newer ideas of life stabilization, a holistic model, et cetera?
That's great. Thank you. That's a perfect time for us to talk a bit about your book. Because One of the things, so the book is Substances, Welfare, and Social Relations, Breaking Stigma, Pursuing Hope. And when I read that title, and I love, as I looked at your book, this emphasis around hope and sort of thinking about what hope means in 2024. And as you're talking about wondering what the future will look like in many ways, can you tell us a bit about, what inspired the book, what it's about from your perspective?
Yeah. The book really came out of research I had done for several years in Ontario, where again, I kept in some way doing research with people experiencing low income, and with their and with them telling me stories of their relationships with Ontario Works policy. And then just by accident, in the way that happens with the way we, at least as a qualitative researcher, the way I engage in sampling and kind of snowballing from initial participants and like building up the sample through word of mouth, et cetera, I kept accidentally meeting people where we'd be sitting having conversations, and then somehow in the course of the conversation, they would share that they were also working through substance use challenges. And because of the nature of the past projects I'd done, often these were people who had children, whether they were living with children and parenting with children, or whether they were co-parenting with their children actually living in the care of others, but somehow involved in their child's lives. And so the book is really inspired by a burning question I had. Well, what is going on? What is going on for people then who are experiencing low income and also working through a substance use challenge? And then I kept thinking, and then what's going on in terms of like, how is Ontario Works policy defining this population or targeting this population? And what are the expectations of them, which goes back to your question about like the earning of what do you need to do in order to receive income support. And so the book really came out of those kinds of questions. And so I set out to do the work, and I'm very thankful for some partnerships I was able to develop with the Toronto Employability and Social Services Department of the City of Toronto. In no way does my book speak in any part about them. These are all my ideas. And so in no way am I offering like any recommendations or critique of the city. Rather, I'm just pointing out that I was able to partner with people working directly with the city in its administering of Ontario Works. Anyway, and through a lot of discussions with them, was able to put together a project where I interviewed people who were indeed accessing Ontario Works, but also self-defined as either experiencing a current substance use challenge or as in recovery. And so the book kind of really came out of earlier research and then my interest in partnering with cities to try to develop a more stronger understanding of people's multiple challenges. And then when I was writing it, though, and thinking about it, and it's very common, and you know this, when you're done policy work, it's very common to say, and now I recommend, or else, these are the policy implications of my work. So I was really aware that the normal outcome of policy-related research, whether it's critical social policy or whether it's policy evaluation research, is to have these recommendations or these implications. And I remember thinking, this isn't working for me because I'm hearing something different in the stories people are telling me. And I'm hearing that actually what really needs to happen is we all, collectively, all humans, really need to rethink about how we deliberately or sometimes unconsciously stigmatize folks who are living with some form of addiction, and how one way we might be able to start to do that is to invoke hope. And I think I wrestled a lot with even playing with the idea of hope, because I'm aware that there are publications in the last 10 years where people are woefully saying hope is gone and, it doesn't exist. And I remember thinking, yeah, I can't do that because I hear hope in the stories of that people are telling me. So the book in the end concludes on a note different than recommendations and implications. And it concludes on, might we shift the discourse about addiction? Might we put that into practice in our social assistance or welfare policies? And how might that prompt us to think differently and do things differently? And then for sure, I conclude more on here you go. Let's all get thinking about shifting the discourse. And I try to cultivate mobilization, if you will. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? So what does it look to engage with, a praxis of hope?
Oh, yeah, I can try. I think for the way I've articulated it in the book is I talk at length about how, in the final chapter, how with certain social problems, such as people who are low income and they are living with substance use challenges, there can be a tendency to collectively feel hopelessness, or to feel like this is a problem that persists and it's just going to keep persisting. And I wanted to instead think about what if we responded to our family, our friends, our loved ones, to people we live with in our communities, with a general feeling of hope for what may change, or what may come to be. And so the language I use most often in the book is actionable hope. And so to try to put that into policy terms as closely as possible, that's simply where if someone is sitting across from their welfare caseworker and they're talking about dreams and ideas they have for the future, if the welfare caseworker meets them with a general orientation of hopefulness for their future, they may then be present and ready to work with someone to provide more supports, to work harder with the discretion they do have to support that person as they try to pursue new pathways. So the minutia of how that looks in practice, no, I didn't develop that in full, but the general orientation I tried to develop of we can have policies that have hope at their very beginning instead of policies such that they can at times, as we all know, just to give you one really quick example, the very fact that welfare policies are below the poverty level for all cities, it perpetuates poverty. So if we can instead have a different orientation, maybe we can even dream of policies that finally do provide people with a more reasonable income, or basic income, as people like to talk about. Yeah.
It's so interesting, right? And I really appreciate that you're able to take so many really big sector conversations and bring them together, right? Because these are big issues. How do you feel when people call them wicked problems?
Wicked problems. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say both sad and angry as basic feelings, because on the one hand, sad that problems can always be worked on, if you will, or resolved, or we can always move forward. But there are times when we get kind of stuck where we think there's problems that are just impossible to solve. So that would make me sad. The anger would be me saying, in my view, low income and living with addiction are not social problems. They're part of how we all live, each and every one of us. So meaning it may not be our own personal problem, but we know people we care about who are struggling with these things, or we as a community live collectively with people who are working through these troubles. So in essence, they're all our troubles. So the anger then spurs me onward to sort of say, I have a different orientation to these very everyday experiences that people are going through. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is in a roundabout way, and I'm sorry, I'm not really answering the questions very well, but I would rather say in a roundabout way in this book, I try really hard not to frame these as problems. To me, they're just part of life. And so like the whole idea of also injecting hope at the end was to say like, we are all collectively living with this at all times. We might as well just get on with it and figure out like a positive, fruitful way forward, and resist like pejorative assumptions about people living with addiction. Resist classifying addiction as deviance, etc. Actually, we are all so close to many of these apparent wicked problems. So I'd rather like displace that and say, let's see what we can do living together with hope.
Well, that's a perfect place to end it. As long as you promise, I would love to have you come back and talk about these ideas around hope and the role of the university as it continues to sort of...
that would be super fun.
Yeah, I'd love to have that conversation if you're willing. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Our knowledge mobilization team includes Jeff, Maijo Birch, Kristen Bentz, Andrea Morehouse, Frankie Fowle, Mara Penner, Sharon Strauss, and Emma Hones. Our theme music is by Chris Micah, and I'm Dr. Martha Dow. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time here on the CHASIcast.
The CHASIcast is a production of the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub at the University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, British Columbia.